Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where we answer your questions about the 2024 election. I'm Isabel Lohman, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. You all had a lot of questions, everything from the mechanics of voting to how the two candidates' proposals about the economy would affect your lives, and questions about campaign finance as well. We have Lauren Gibbons, Jordan Hermany, and Simon Schuster here to answer your questions. If you have a different question for our reporters, you can drop them in the chat. If you missed part of our show, you can see a full recap on our website. And please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a show. All right, it's actually already voting season in Michigan because this week, local election clerks will be mailing out absentee ballots to voters this Thursday. Simon, Republicans have previously been hesitant about early voting in previous election cycles. What are they saying now, and why does that matter?
Yeah, I think I should first address why Republicans love early voting, and Democrats as well. And part of it is because they can use it. They have limited resources throughout the election season, or I should say voting season at this point. And so if you can get your base to mail in votes, that means that both the parties can check whether someone's received an absentee ballot and whether they've turned it in. And so if you get your base, your reliable supporters to do all of that, then during this voting season, you can spend all of your precious resources trying to get those persuadable voters, those folks who really you want to pull out of the woodwork and bring you over the line in election season. And so the difficulty that Republicans are having is that former President Donald Trump has decried and sort of discredited mail-in and early voting for the past 4 years. And so as Republicans are attempting to pivot now and tell people that it's good to, they've used terms like bank your vote or swamp the vote. They avoid saying absentee voting and they like to say mail-in voting. And they're trying to convince people to do this even as the top of their ticket, the leader of their party, is telling people that this process is corrupt and that you shouldn't trust it. They have videos of him recorded saying that, you should vote any way you can. They're all good options. But then when he gets up on those rally stages, he often tends to say the opposite.
I imagine that's a little confusing for folks who are on the fence about if they should vote in the first place and then how they should vote. There's also more options in Michigan because in 2022, voters approved 9 days of early in-person voting. Lauren, you've been covering this for quite a while. What should our audience know about how this will work?
Yeah, for the average voter, changes aren't going to seem very seismic. Polling locations for early voting operate very similarly to election day polling places. Essentially, it's the same process as if you were to go in and vote on election day. It is very important to check, though, where your early voting location is, as that may be different from your election day precinct polling place. And also be sure to check the hours as well for when the polling locations are in operation. As for the process as a whole for elections officials, there were a few bumps in the road to get a new process off the ground. Certainly having several additional days of in-person voting requires a lot of staff and a lot of changes administratively, but they've had run-throughs of the new process for both the presidential and state primaries in February and August, respectively. So officials are at least familiar with the process at this point. But all that said, so far, absentee voting remains the most popular alternative in Michigan to in-person election day voting. We saw that change. No reason absentee voting was approved in 2018, and that still appears to be the most popular option for voters other than just going in on election day.
And a total shameless plug for Bridge is that we have an elections tracker where we'll be continuing to keep track of voting updates as well as election updates over the next several weeks. And if you have questions about voting, you can, of course, drop them in the chat or email one of our reporters. Lauren, you were also on the road last week because Vice President Kamala Harris had a talk with Oprah last week. She talked about the economy, gun control policy, and abortion. Why do the event in Oakland County?
Yeah, Oakland County is a really interesting area of Michigan because back in 2020, the suburbs, suburban voters played a really key role in Biden's win here in Michigan. A lot of these voters, previously were either independent or leaning more conservative, but we've seen a shift, particularly in areas like Oakland County. You could also say this similar for Kent County. In West Michigan, of a shift away from Trump, essentially. And it's no secret that it's been trending blue even before Trump in Oakland County. They have not county-wide chosen a Republican candidate for president since 1992. But it's at this point for Republicans critical to really shore up their base in northern Oakland County, which does remain reliably conservative, because it could be key if turnout is high in the area for one party or the other. It's a big county. It's a highly educated county. It's a wealthy county. Typically areas where a lot of votes come from. So it's a big deal, and it makes a lot of sense that both Harris and former President Trump have spent time there.
For sure. And you can see that voter enthusiasm. Lauren interviewed several folks, both on the Trump side and on the Harris side last week in Oakland County, and that's on our website. On the flip side, former President Donald Trump has also spent a lot of time in Michigan in recent weeks. Simon, you've been going to those rallies and those talks. One reader wants to know if Trump's proposal for tariffs will lead to worse inflation. What do we know?
Yeah, so obviously tariffs are a huge part of our global economic system. President Donald Trump is someone who's been an enormous proponent of these as a trade tool, and we've seen them enacted as well by the Biden administration. But I think there's a very strong consensus among economists that when tariffs are levied, those prices are passed on to consumers, because at the end result is it's raising the prices of imported goods, and then similarly domestic goods can raise their prices to commit to compete with those now tariff levied imported goods. And so these are things that are a huge proponent, both Biden and Trump administration. But ultimately, if you see these enacted, it is going to lead to raising prices. However, whether or not that leads to inflation is a complicated question. It has more to do with federal monetary policy and a host of other factors. So I'd say tariffs on individual goods alone, we can't say definitively that it could lead to worse inflation, but it could be a component of an inflationary economic environment. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it would be the sole contributing factor.
Well, and I think it is interesting to note, too, that earlier in the month, or even late last month, apologies, time flies by on the political trail, was talking with the Michigan Republican Party chair, Pete Hoekstra, and he even admitted that a tariff wouldn't necessarily make things cheaper for the average American consumer. So I just think that it goes to show that that's not some sort of silver bullet that's going to help us out economically here. I believe last time I checked, Trump has proposed about a 10% across the board tariff on imports and 60% tariffs on imports specifically from China. And if you think about it, how many things in our lives even are touched by Chinese manufacturing. I mean, alone, I actually just looked it up. My watch, virtually every component of it, Chinese manufactured. So, we could probably expect to see higher prices for the American consumer. But yeah, to Simon's point, it's a little hard to read the tea leaves and say whether or not that's going to result in worse inflation.
Thanks for that. We had another reader who reached out because he was concerned about the cost of a college education. He said it took a lot of money for his daughter to get her bachelor's degree. Jordan, do either presidential candidate have a plan to address high prices of attending college, and what can be done about it?
So the short and long answer is somewhat. Neither one of them have been particularly clear on what a plan for lowering higher education would be. I know that Trump, for instance, has pitched something called the American University. He's tried to bill it as this sort of catch-all university that you'd be able to publicly subsidize by taxing endowments from other universities, but how that would work is extremely vague. Not to throw it back to you, Isabel, but I know that you've been also following this pretty heavily, and I'm certain you can probably speak to that much better than I could.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct in that both candidates haven't laid out extremely detailed higher education proposals. And on the Biden-Harris side, one of the things that they've talked about is reducing the cost of college, both in terms of expanding Pell Grant accessibility, but also trying to lower the monthly payment that people have to make on their student loans. Some of that, which is part of something called the SAVE plan, has actually been stopped in courts. And then, of course, the broader student loan package, which was to forgive student loans, that has also been stopped by the courts. So we're seeing some broad, vague ideas, but we're not seeing incredibly specific things. On the state level, there are some specific programs for people, for example, teachers and social workers, for the state to help pay back student loans. Of course, it's important to know that sometimes these are only true for public loans, and then there are nonprofits and private companies who might be able to help with anything you have questions on the private loan side of things. And then Simon, kind of a different financial question, but we know some stuff about Elon Musk and his involvement in the Michigan election. Can you talk to us about the super PAC and what we know about in Michigan?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things that we've seen that's different from this election cycle is that a lot of the Trump campaign financial resources have been focused on so-called election integrity efforts. And so there's prior reporting in Atlantic Magazine showing that the Trump campaign has pivoted away from using a substantial chunk of its financial resources on these sort of lawsuits that have been brought by the Republican National Committee towards sort of chipping away at some of the attempts by Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to make voting more accessible. But Republicans and conservatives concerned about this see it as opening the door to fraud. And so as a result, we have also new rulings coming in for the Federal Election Commission that says that these super PACs, these independent expenditure committees, are able to partner more closely with parties and campaigns than they have in the past. And so America PAC, a super PAC that was founded by Elon Musk, and from what we understand, primarily funded by him, the world's richest person, is getting on the ground along with some other organizations such as Turning Point Action and working with the party to some extent to get out the vote. And so America PAC in general is hiring canvassers, as is Turning Point Action, and they're paying these folks between $22 to $30 an hour, according to job listings that were posted online. And so this is certainly a way that we're seeing under our current campaign finance environment, our campaigns evolving. We're seeing more of the work that campaigns traditionally did in-house become outsourced. And because these super PACs can receive unlimited amounts of money, it means that the funding for these efforts, at the state level, people knocking doors, going door to door, is essentially only limited by the financial resources that super PAC has by being able to accept unlimited donations. And founded by the world's richest person, could be considerable depending upon how much money he chooses to give. However, at the same time, we don't actually know how much is going on in the ground game right now. We haven't seen a lot of evidence of people going out in force, seeing a lot of volunteers on the ground knocking doors, trying to bring out some of these voters. Evidently, what we're hearing from campaigns and these outside groups is that they're trying to be highly targeted in the voters they contact. And so whether those people are receiving lots of contacts, and that's why we're not seeing a wide volunteer effort, remains up in the air. But those are the things that are sort of difficult to get at, how much money is being spent on canvassing in Michigan right now. But we do know that some of these outside efforts are playing an unprecedented role.
For sure. And it seems like that quality versus quantity thing, you might be getting a lot for one undecided voter versus quantity, a wide swath of ads for a lot of different people. Thank you for that. We've also gotten a lot of audience questions over the last several weeks about people who come to the country illegally and if they can vote in an election. We want to break this down. So Simon, let's start with the basics. Are non-citizens allowed to vote in the election?
No, that would be illegal. That'd be an instance of voter fraud. And so there's certain protections and safeguards in place to prevent folks from doing that. Primarily, one is that if you're trying to vote for the first time, and even if you can't provide a valid form of identification, then you can only cast a provisional ballot, which means that you can. For example, if you don't bring a valid photo ID or correct form of identification to a polling place, you can sign an affidavit saying that under penalty of perjury, I'm able to vote. And so if it's your first time voting and that's what you have to sign, that means you have to come back to the clerk within 6 days of the election, showing that you have the correct documents to really make yourself eligible to vote. Those include Michigan's driver's license from another state, another sort of identification, a U.S. passport, military ID, and then some of the ones that have gotten folks a little bit, people who are concerned about voter fraud in particular, despite evidence that there is not ongoing widespread voter fraud, is utility bills and student IDs, specifically because folks do not have to be citizens to have these voter identifications. But at the same time, we do have a series of audits that sort of try to verify these things post-election, conducted by election officials, to try to see if this is happening. And in instances where it has happened, they've generally been isolated, and those individuals have been charged. So the long and skinny of it is no, they cannot. And we have a system of safeguards in place to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you for that. And you just listed several different forms of proof of identification that someone can use to vote. Where can people, if they have more questions about this, where can they find that information?
Yeah, I would turn towards the Michigan Secretary of State's website, but also Bridge as well has a series of election FAQs, both these own episodes that you can turn back to where we've discussed this information, or our own articles that talk about what's required in voting and how those processes work.
Great. We've also gotten this question several times, so let's answer it. Can those who come here illegally get a driver's license and then use that driver's license to vote?
No, they cannot. That's also not allowed. And it has been an issue that immigration advocates in particular have pushed for. Advocates for undocumented immigrants in particular have wanted those individuals to be able to receive driver's licenses so that they can commute and earn a living while residing in the United States without threat of being detained or deported just by commuting to their jobs. However, that legislation has not moved through the legislature.
Thank you. And another reader asked, can people bring firearms into polling places?
So that's kind of a difficult question, frankly. Michigan has tried before to explicitly ban bringing guns to polling locations. Several years ago, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson attempted to make a rule outlining that, but courts inevitably threw it out, saying that she did not follow the correct rulemaking processes. The Michigan legislature late last year did introduce a bill to basically codify what Benson was attempting to do. But since then, it's passed in both chambers, but hasn't moved insofar as gaining Governor Whitmer's signature. So the rule of thumb is we really don't have any clear rules. It usually does come down to the fact of wherever your polling location is, they might have explicit bans on firearms. I'm thinking churches, schools, but there is no one size fits all uniform guidance for that topic, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, Jordan. And then we had a different reader who wanted to know about campaign contributions. This person asked, for example, if a school board candidate receives funds from the Michigan Education Association, do they have to disclose that? And broadly, are candidates required to disclose contributions to their campaigns?
Yeah, so the rule of thumb, generally speaking, is that any candidate who raises or spends more than $1,000 in an election cycle is required to disclose that fundraising as campaign finance disclosures to their local authority. Now, it's important to note that while you may go online and look at the Secretary of State's website for things like legislators, the governor, or super PACs that are statewide in Michigan, the local candidates do not file with the state. They file with their county clerks. And what that means is that the vast majority of county clerks in the state, all but I believe 14, don't have a way to access those campaign finance reports online. So if you're interested in those local candidates and you want to know what's going on in terms of their donations and fundraising, you're probably going to be going down to your county clerk's office and you're going to have to request those documents in person. Some of them, unfortunately, might even, if you want to take a copy of it home, they might even charge you to copy those. It's one of the, I think, the deficits in our campaign finance law that sort of limits accessibility for individuals who want to know about the fundraising and spending in local elections. But it is a way, at least, for people to access and review those documents if you so choose. They have to allow you to do that and cannot charge you for simply reviewing them.
Thanks for that. And Simon's our resident campaign finance expert. So if you all have more questions about campaign finance, you can drop them in the chat. We've got questions. We've got time for just a couple more reader questions. We had another reader who asked us this week if voter drop boxes are monitored.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. So in 2020, there was a bipartisan law that was passed requiring municipalities to have video monitoring of their drop boxes within 75 days of an election. That said, because it takes a long time to implement that, and there's a lot of local communities involved, with old drop boxes, municipalities have until 2026 to add in the video monitoring. If there are any new drop boxes, those are automatically required to have video monitoring. So that's part of the install process. But for some of these old ones around the state, there may not be drop box video monitoring just quite yet. They will all be in place by the 2026 election. Some cities used COVID-19 money that was designated to election operations to buy video surveillance equipment in 2020. And there are other safeguards in place to ensure that ballot drop boxes are securely locked, affixed to the ground, or another stationary object, and city officials do have to regularly monitor any drop boxes that don't have that video monitoring in place within that 75 days prior to the election to make sure it complies with state law. Clerks are also required to document when ballot applications and ballot returns are picked up from these drop boxes. So clerks are required to collect and keep that information for at least 22 months after the election.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And then we had a follow-up question about campaign finance from a reader. They asked, are all donations to candidates reportable or only over a certain amount?
That's a good question. There is a threshold that's quite low that is not generally reportable. And of course, I should also note that donations in cash are not permitted. You have to cut a check or you have to use an online payment system. But what we'd see for the most part, to be frank with you, is most donations are itemized. It's a safeguard for candidates. It allows them to show how we got this money in case of an inquiry. And a lot of campaign donation processing software, WinRed for Republicans, ActBlue for Democrats, is generally the simplest and most straightforward way for folks to accept and report campaign donations these days. So when they utilize that, every donation is being itemized. So increasingly, like for the last two gubernatorial elections, neither Gretchen Whitmer nor Tudor Dixon had a lot of unitemized donations in them. And so it's not something that we come across a whole lot anymore. But technically, yes, a lot of small dollar donations don't necessarily have to be itemized, although we generally see it do happen.
Thanks for that. And then we also had a question about the training that poll workers receive to make sure that the voters that are appearing have proper identification. I'm wondering if Lauren or Simon, you can chime in there.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It was
Yeah,
about
the question.
polling.
Yeah, the question was just what type of training do poll workers receive when it comes to making sure to verify someone's identity when they come to vote?
Yeah, there's a pretty robust training that poll workers are required to receive, and there are a lot of rules, guides around around that process. There are several different roles. You can either be the poll worker, helping the local election officials with the election process, or you can also volunteer as a poll challenger for either Republicans or Democrats to monitor the process. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the background, for lack of a better word, to make sure this process goes smoothly. It involves many hands in many municipalities across Michigan's 83 counties. So it's a very localized process here in Michigan. That means that, while the Secretary of State does have rules that come from the top, at the local level, clerks and election officials and poll workers are, constantly, getting training and trying to stay up to date on these big changes that have come in the last several election cycles.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And I think it's important to note that we do answer questions both in the chat, but we also get questions throughout the week. Readers can submit a question when they sign up for the event. They can email a question to our journalists, or they can simply submit it on our elections tracker. So that's how we're coming up with these questions. And we want to continue to answer your questions as we get closer and closer to voting day. I'm going to end on this last one. So we've got former President Donald Trump is coming to Michigan. He's got 2 stops this week. We also have his running mate J.D. Vance coming on Wednesday. Time is running out for both Trump and Harris to pitch why they should be. Let me start over. Time is running out for Trump and Harris to make their pitch to voters. For each reporter, I'm curious, what are voters telling you they still need to hear to make their decision in the election? Lauren, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think at this point, Michigan's undecided voters are pretty popular around the country. Everybody wants to know what they are interested in. I think, on the ground, we're still seeing a lot of concerns about economic issues, inflation. Manufacturing has come up quite a bit in Michigan's, among voters in terms of China's influence, what the future of electric vehicles and some of these planned manufacturing plants are, but also, some of the other issues are issues that have come up in previous cycles and ones that you might expect, especially for Democrats, have been bringing up reproductive rights issues quite a bit, gun reform measures that have occurred here in Michigan and have been pushed at the federal level. And certainly, there are some other issues hanging out there, but a lot of it is just fundamentally, how these candidates are going to address the kitchen table issues.
Simon,
Yeah,
Jordan?
I kind of second everything Lauren said, not to be a cop out, but I mean that's what it keeps coming back to, right? Is people are most concerned with the most tangible to them. And so if I'm seeing my grocery bill go up, if I'm seeing that my gas is more expensive, if I'm feeling like my child can't get an education, it's people looking to that. But then I also feel like a broken record in underscoring this, that people are just also kind of burnt out by this election cycle. And that's also kind of another reason why we're seeing so many people saying, yeah, I really don't know who to vote for. I mean, I was just at home in the Metro Detroit area over the weekend talking to some folks who said, I'm trying not to think about the election. I know that this is important, but I can't think about, how mad it makes me or how resigned it makes me, how sad it makes me. So there are just people who are hanging on to that 11th hour until they'll either not vote simply, which is a thing that can happen that I feel like we also don't talk about enough during speaking of uncommitted voters. But yeah, it's the kitchen table issues, and then it's just being tired of it all, frankly.
Yeah, I would say,
Simon.
obviously, I have to echo what my colleagues are saying here, but also I think there's a lot of voter dissatisfaction around the rhetoric that we've heard from both of these campaigns. As I think everyone knows at this point, this is a presidential election that's going to be decided at the margins. And there's key small constituencies that both of these candidates are trying to draw out, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, both. But when they look at the fundamental issues that are motivating people like the economy, that's not what they're hearing about from these candidates. Trump talks about common sense as one of the things that he's going to use to drive down inflation, or that he has concepts of a plan to improve healthcare costs. And at the same time, Kamala Harris, she's currently serving as vice president. And so when Donald Trump attacks her and says, you have all these plans that you want to execute, why aren't you doing them right now? Because you're serving in office as the second highest elected official in the country. You haven't really gotten a satisfying answer from her. And so you hear these messages where Trump, he has running campaign ads directly targeting auto workers. You have Kamala Harris, who's talking a lot about abortion, after which folks who were driven to go to the polls in Michigan in 2022 to vote on Proposal 3, some of these folks, from what I've talked to, it says, we made the state constitutional amendment. I don't necessarily, Trump says he's not going to do a national ban. I don't know if I'm persuaded about this, but both of these campaigns are targeting the constituencies that they care about. And these folks that have already made up their minds, they're not, the folks that have already knew who they're going to vote for. The messages that these candidates are putting out are not for them. And so some of these undecided voters, they might have some of these pocketbook issues that neither of these candidates have been able to communicate very well on. And I think that that's something that's leading to some of this burnout and fatigue that Jordan was talking about, and might make it more difficult to drive some of these voters to the polls. So I think that most of the hard work is going to be done from the ground games that we had talked about earlier in this FAQ, and ensuring that, people are chasing ballots, getting those absentee ballots returned, and driving out the vote. Trump is really interested in low propensity voters, trying to raise the ceiling on what he believes is the folks that are going to back him. And we're not going to hear a lot, I think, that is going to have broad appeal in these next few weeks. That would be my gamble anyway. But instead, that we're going to be hearing a lot of targeted messages towards these margins that both candidates believe can win them Michigan.
Thanks for that. And if you all are anything like me, you're probably getting a ton of ads when you watch a YouTube video right now as well about the political candidates. But Bridge is here to help you all, whether it's answering your reader questions in a live episode or on our website, or you just want to know what the candidates are saying at their rallies and speeches. We have reporters at all of these different events so that we are documenting the news and we're able to answer your questions. So thank you so much for spending part of your morning here. Jordan, Lauren, Simon, thank you for answering these questions. If you all have more questions, you can go to our website at bridgemi.com. And if you go to bridgemi.com/signup, you can get our free Politics Watch newsletter. That comes out a couple times a week. And we also have an elections tracker and a nonpartisan voter guide. We would love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be back next week with more elections FAQ. We hope you have a good rest of your day.